There's a certain kind of smell that clings to the coastal towns of Maine in late February. It's a mix of salt, pine, and the damp, earthy scent of thawing ground, a promise of a distant spring. But in the small fishing village of Port Clyde in February of 2007, a new smell had joined the familiar chorus. It was a foul, cloying odor, a stench of decay so thick and heavy it felt like you could taste it on the back of your tongue. It was a smell that had teeth, and it was coming from the home of the Hackett family. On the morning of February 20th, the dispatcher at the Knox County Sheriff's Office took a call. The voice on the other end belonged to Martha Cranston, a woman in her late 60s whose family had lived next to the Hacketts for 3 generations. She sounded distressed, her voice tight with a mixture of disgust and fear. The smell, she said, had been getting worse for over a week. It wasn't the usual smell of low tide or fish guts. This was the smell of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. She was worried. 2 deputies, a seasoned veteran named Harding and a younger, eager officer named Mills, were dispatched along with a crime scene technician. They pulled up to the Hackett house, a modest, weather-beaten Cape Cod whose white paint was peeling to reveal the gray, salt-scoured wood beneath. The smell hit them the moment they stepped out of the patrol car. It was a physical presence, a miasma of putrescence that made Mills gag and Harding's eyes water. It intensified as they approached the back of the house, a wave of sickness rolling off the property. The door was opened by Diane Hackett, the wife of the fisherman, David Hackett. She was a thin, wiry woman in her late 30s, with restless eyes that darted back and forth, never meeting theirs. A nervous energy hummed off her, a stark contrast to the sluggish, heavy air. Her answers to their questions were a cascade of evasions and half-truths. Her husband David, she claimed, had gone out on his lobster boat on February 12th. A good haul was expected. He might be gone for a while. Her mother-in-law, Eleanor Hackett, who lived with them, had left on the 10th. She'd gone up to Portland to visit her daughter, Diane said, a faint, unconvincing smile plastered on her face. But Martha Cranston, watching from her kitchen window, had already told the deputies a different story. She hadn't seen David's truck in weeks. She hadn't seen old Eleanor tending to a small garden out back. The story about the fishing trip and the visit to Portland felt thin, a poorly constructed lie over a gaping hole of truth. The crime scene tech, a sharp young woman named Chen, began a slow, methodical sweep of the property. The stench was a guide, leading her to the backyard. It was strongest there, concentrated around a large, homemade fish smoker built from cinder blocks and a heavy-duty septic tank, its concrete lid half hidden by overgrown weeds. The smell was a pungent, unholy blend of rotting fish and something else, something human. Chen noticed fresh scrape marks in the dirt around the septic lid, as if it had been recently pried open and then settled back into place, not quite perfectly. Near the smoker, she found them. Dark, rust-colored stains on the frozen ground, flaked and cracked by the cold. They looked like blood. She carefully took samples from the stains. She pried open the small inspection port on the septic tank, the smell that erupted nearly knocking her backward, and drew a sample of the murky, dark brown liquid within. She did the same with the brine in the fish smoker. Something was terribly wrong here. Harding made a call to the harbormaster down at the docks. The answer came back in minutes. David Hackett had not registered his boat, the Sea Serpent, for a fishing trip since February 10th. He hadn't bought bait. He hadn't refueled. The boat was sitting right there at its mooring, bobbing peacefully in the harbor. Diane Hackett's story was not just a lie. It was an impossibility. Later that day, the preliminary DNA results came back from the state lab. The dark stains in the backyard were human blood. On February 22nd, the police returned. This time, they came with a septic pumping truck and a warrant that gave them the authority to take the entire property apart if they had to. The air was thick with a grim, silent tension, punctuated by the grumble of the truck's engine. Diane Hackett was confined to her kitchen, watched over by a female deputy. Her face was a blank, emotionless mask. She watched the proceedings from her window with an unnerving, vacant calm. The team started with the septic tank. The stench that billowed out when they removed the heavy lid was a physical assault, a smell of pure corruption. As the powerful pump began to suck the foul, sludgy water from the concrete pit, the technicians began the grim task of sifting through the filth. For 2 hours they worked in a nauseating silence. Then one of them called out. He held up a small, sodden piece of purple-brown fabric, the kind you'd see on an old woman's housecoat. A few minutes later, another find, a clump of long, grey hair matted together with filth. They moved on to the fish smoker. A different kind of horror awaited them there. As they drained the cloudy, stinking brine, something white became visible at the bottom of the tank. Bones. Large, white bone fragments. A forensic expert on the scene, a man who had seen more than his share of death, knelt down and examined them. "Not fish," he said, his voice low and grim. "These are human. An arm bone, I think, maybe a forearm, from an adult male." It seemed they had found what was left of David Hackett. The next day, the final DNA results confirmed their fears. The blood in the backyard was a definitive match for David Hackett. The bone fragments from the smoker were, with 99.9% certainty, his. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place when a different neighbor came forward. He remembered hearing a vicious, screaming argument coming from the Hackett house on the night of February 10th. It was Eleanor, the old matriarch, and her daughter-in-law, Diane. Their voices had been filled with a raw, venomous hatred. The police refocused their attention on the septic tank. They now believed, with a sickening certainty, that if David's butchered remains were in the smoker, then Eleanor's were in the septic tank. They returned to the tank, this time with shovels and sifters for a more thorough excavation of the remaining sludge. After hours of grim, back-breaking work, they found her, a piece of a cheekbone, small and delicate, fragments of a human skull. The remains were consistent with those of an elderly woman. The state of decomposition was more advanced than David's remains. She had been killed first. The investigation now had 2 victims, a timeline, and a prime suspect who sat in her kitchen wrapped in a blanket of chilling composure. But the police knew Diane Hackett couldn't have done it alone. Dismembering a grown man and disposing of 2 bodies required more strength than she possessed. They began to dig into her life, her relationships, her secrets, and they quickly found a name. Trent Collins, a 38-year-old local fisherman, a man with a reputation for a quick temper and a wandering eye. A man who, the town gossips whispered, was having an affair with Diane. The forensic evidence began to form a net, drawing tighter around the 2 of them. They found a meat cleaver hidden behind a loose board in a kitchen cupboard. It had been scrubbed clean, but microscopic traces of blood remained in the crevices. It was David Hackett's blood. In the backyard shed, they found a frayed nylon rope, stained with what turned out to be Eleanor's blood. And then there was the wooden mallet, a heavy tool used for cracking open lobster claws, tucked away in a dusty corner of the basement. It was covered in dried, dark stains. On the handle, they found the fingerprints of both Diane Hackett and Trent Collins. A later analysis of the stains on the mallet head revealed traces of Eleanor Hackett's blood. Trent Collins, when brought in for questioning, was a wall of denial. He was just friends with Diane, he said. He hadn't been to her house in months. But security camera footage from a gas station a quarter-mile down the road showed his pickup truck turning onto the Hackett Street late on the night of February 10th and again late on the night of the 12th. The motive began to crystallize, a toxic brew of long-simmering family conflict and cold, hard greed. Eleanor Hackett, by all accounts, was a difficult woman. She despised her daughter-in-law, believing her to be lazy and unfaithful. She had been threatening to convince David to divorce Diane and kick her out of the house. David, for his part, was a jealous and controlling husband prone to fits of rage. And then there was the money. David had a substantial savings account, nearly $80,000. He was also in the process of purchasing a valuable piece of coastal land, an investment that would be worth a fortune one day. After the murders, Diane had been seen at a pawn shop in a neighboring town, selling a gold wedding ring that matched the description of the one Eleanor always wore. The final damning piece of evidence came from an old discarded cell phone of Diane's that the police had found in her trash. The forensics lab managed to retrieve deleted text messages. One from the evening of February 9th, the night before Eleanor was likely killed, was from Trent. "Be there after 11, it read. Another, from the night of February 12th, the night David was likely murdered, was a message from Diane to Trent. It was short and chillingly direct. "Do as we planned and everything will be fine." Under the crushing weight of the evidence, the suspects began to crumble. They turned on each other, a desperate, pathetic attempt to save their own skins. Trent Collins broke first. He admitted to helping dispose of the bodies, but he painted himself as a victim, a man coerced by a manipulative woman. He claimed Diane had threatened to expose their affair to his wife and to the whole town if he didn't help her. He described in a halting, horrified whisper how he had seen Diane strike her mother-in-law with the wooden mallet after a screaming match, then watched as she dragged the old woman's limp body out to the septic tank. He confessed that 2 nights later, after David had gotten into a violent argument with Diane, she had signaled for him to help. He admitted that he had followed her instructions, using the heavy meat cleaver to dismember David's body in the basement so it would fit into the small opening of the fish smoker. Diane Hackett remained a fortress of denial. She never admitted to murder. She admitted to asking Trent for help moving heavy objects. She admitted to the constant, bitter conflict with her mother-in-law, but her story was a hollow shell shattered by the mountain of evidence against her. The police and later the prosecution pieced together the brutal, cold-blooded sequence of events. On the night of February 10th, after a vicious argument over her affair and her future in the house, Diane Hackett had murdered her mother-in-law. She had then called her lover, Trent, to help her dispose of the body in the septic tank. 2 nights later, on February 12th, she had killed her husband. She needed to silence him, and she wanted his money, his land, his future. Again, she called Trent, and again he came, this time participating not just in the disposal, but in the brutal, gruesome act of butchering a human body. On March 28, 2007, both suspects were formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial was swift. On April 2nd, the court delivered its verdict. For her role as the mastermind for the cold-blooded, financially motivated murders of her husband and her mother-in-law, Diane Hackett, was sentenced to death. For his role as a willing, if perhaps reluctant, accomplice, for his part in the second murder and the horrific disposal of the bodies, Trent Collins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of the Hackett family murders left a deep, ugly scar on the small, tight-knit community of Port Clyde. It was a story that laid bare the devastating consequences of long-simmering family conflicts, a story of how resentment, jealousy, and greed could fester in the dark corners of a home until they erupted in an act of unimaginable violence. It was a macabre tale of how the most mundane, everyday household items, a meat cleaver for cutting fish, a rope for tying down a boat, a mallet for cracking lobster claws, a septic tank, a fish smoker, could be twisted into the tools of a monstrous crime. It was a grim, chilling reminder that sometimes the most horrific secrets are not buried deep in the woods or at the bottom of the cold, gray ocean, but right in our own backyards, hidden in plain sight, their foul, lingering stench a testament to the fact that the truth, no matter how deeply or grotesquely it is buried, cannot be hidden forever.